Okay, so one of the next things I wanted to talk about mission statements and quadrants and just kind of what is he talking about there, centering your life. And so one of the questions that kind of people ask me whenever I talk about what I'm doing in this class, uh, they kind of ask me, how do the 7 habits really develop into leadership qualities? Because they really seem to be inwardly focused for the first 3 chapters, anyways. And so one of the things that I want to keep you to keep in mind is that when you're learning these principles or these habits, the idea for the first 3 anyways are to help a person become independent, right? There's a transitionary period from dependence to independence, interdependence. And the idea there is that everybody starts off dependent. They develop these skills that make them independent, right, where they can function on their own, but then become interdependent. It's really what Covey's kind of talking about as being part of a group and using parts of that group. That could be any kind of group. That's a relationship, whether it be a spouse, whether it be friends, whether it be coworkers, and you're creating this interdependent unit that can then be used to if led correctly, can be used to achieve greater goals than you could with an independent individual. And so it's kind of the sum of the parts are bigger. How does that go? What basically what one person can do on their own, if you put together 5 people of the same quality, they're going to be able to achieve much greater things than what they could have ever achieved on their own. The sum's greater than the parts, I think is what I'm trying to say. Anyways, so Covey's talking about in here getting away from being that dependent person so that you can be independent or eventually become interdependent and then develop these skills in your employees or in your subordinates, so to speak. And so the idea behind being a leader is that you've not only cultivated these skills in yourself, but now you're starting to cultivate them in other people. And so the goal there, I suppose, would then be for you to start, whether this be for yourself or be in other individuals, thinking about where the center is for these people. So he talks a lot about people that are maybe money centered, for example. And then if you look, I think it was on page 133, where he kind of explains what it looks like if a person is principle centered. Well, in this case, we're looking at different types of centering, and so you can kind of look at what that would look like. You can see what that would look like if you were to put a person's life as being money centered. And so you think about what that looks like. And look at the examples that they have on page 133. So you have things like family, you have things like work, possessions, I think even there and somewhere they have church. What else? Friends, enemies. And I got covered by a piece of paper. Oh, spouse and self. And so I've actually kind of drawn this backwards from what he puts on page 133, but I've done that on purpose because the idea here is to think about what this would look like compared to what he has there. And so, with a money centered individual, what does that look like with possessions? Well, they're trying to get the best possessions. The church, to me, that would be something like a person that maybe focuses on tithing so that they can get more money. All right. There are other options there. I'm really not too sure what that would look like in church, but that's just the one that comes to mind. Friends probably look like someone having the most money or wanting to be that perceived as that individual who has the most money. Enemies, kind of the same deal. Or this one, maybe not exactly the same deal because with friends, you're not necessarily wanting to be like, oh, I'm the best, I'm the most rich. You want to show that you have the most because you want to be looked up to by your friends, perhaps. But then if you look at enemies, you still want to be looked up to. But whenever you're looking at the enemies, this might manifest itself as being I'm better than you type of situation. And that's simply because they have more money if it's a money-centered individual. Spouse, that would be the relationship would focus around being money-centered. So not necessarily having a strong relationship, but how can we make more money between us, or I make more money than you, and so you need to do this. And so certain dynamics would change because it's money-centered. I don't even really know what to write there. But the same thing about family, maybe a little less family time so that they can go off and make more money, maybe workaholic type of situation where we're just focusing on money. And so the same thing with self, so I won't go into that any further. But then if you change that a little bit, now if you, do we have room over here? Let's do that. Let's look at this as a side-by-side comparison. So if you have a principal, let's say that our principal, I already talked about morality, what other types of principles are there? Let's say that we want to focus on character. And so when I talk about character, obviously I'm not talking about protagonists, antagonists, things like that. I'm talking about the development of character. Having a good character is someone that can be maybe trustworthy, someone that can be relied upon, things like that. And so when I'm talking about character, maybe we'll put trustworthy in there. Now, if we start to look at these same things, we start to look at a person that is trustworthiness, where they are centered on being trustworthy. That is kind of their principal center. That's what they hold most important in life, right? Well, now we start to compare these to the money-centered individual, and now we have in church a person that's trustworthy could be more well, obviously in a leadership role, right? Because they're trustworthy, they can be trusted to do things. But then also, you're going to develop more relationships here, right? Because you're a trustworthy person. So I would probably say relationships. Leadership. With your friends, you become the one that's reliable. Possessions. If you're a trustworthy person, what would your possessions look like? I'm not too sure about that. We have to think about that. Work. There's a lot of things that can come from this, because if you're trustworthy at work, obviously they trust you to do things, right? They trust you with deadlines, they trust you with projects, they trust you with a greater level of responsibility, right? And then, of course, family, they develop reliability, right? You become whatever your role is. You have to consider what your role and your goal is, right? Whatever your role is, that's, for me, obviously, it's easiest for me to relate to being a father. But I think the majority of the people in this class are females. So I guess I'm going to try my hand at being a mom. Um, so with family, if you're a trustworthy mom, I mean, that really develops a lot with the child, having a trustworthy mom, because you know where I'm going with this, I'm assuming, because you are going to develop the child's sense of trust, and from that trust, they're going to lower the risk factor, right? There's not going to be that level of, I have to achieve by myself. They're not thrust from that dependence into that independence prematurely, right? They become, well, let's just say that the mom becomes a foundation. So a foundation for the child to grow up and with less risk and with someone that they can rely on. If they can't rely on them, then they have to rely on themselves, and that becomes a whole mess of different things. But you look at how that compares. So you have reliability to having the most. You have relationships and leadership compared to, you're talking about how it creates tithing for more. Compared to that, if you look at possessions, we already talked about that. Responsibility versus just working for money. Just just here for money. That's not a very rewarding experience. I mean, you do get the money, right? I'll go into screensaver again. You get the money, but that doesn't really develop much happiness, right? If you're just there for the money, you're not really fulfilling as much as you could. You're not reaching that potential, right, for that job. Versus now you're getting more responsibility. If you're character centered, you're getting more responsibility. You're moving up, and you're getting this self satisfaction rather than just monetary satisfaction. That's superficial, right? So, anyways, that's what we're talking about when they talk about these principles and how you can be centered. And then if you start to look at how that action becomes, well, so let's talk about these quadrants. How do you get these things done? So for instance, if we were looking at how do you become that responsible person? How do you, or if not you, then how do you get your employees to become that responsible person? Well, this is where you start developing that mission statement, right? This is where they talk about quadrant work and mission statement. So now you have to develop that mission statement that kind of guides them. And Covey talks a lot about how it's a good idea to have different sections of a place of employment. So for instance, if in my school here, you could maybe have the media services, you could have the library, you could have the psychology department, the math department. All these departments come up with the mission statement. Because what that does is it creates a focal point. It creates something that that guides time and effort that can be focused on a single goal for the entire institution. So one of the things that I really want to focus on now that I just kind of popped in my head is that a lot of people wonder, what is the difference between leadership and management? I was actually talking to my wife about this not too long ago, is that the leadership guy, he talks a lot in Covey's, whenever you're looking at the quadrant, the leadership person does a lot of work in quadrant 2. What does that mean? I'll explain that in just a second, but bear with me for a second because I need you to understand what is the difference between a leader and a manager first. So the leader, think about this. This is our organization. This is everything that's done within our confines. So if we're a school, this is all the education that's taking place. If we are a business, these are all the products that are being distributed, or if we're maybe a church, this is all the stuff that's being done by that church. So everything the church has their hands in, or everything the institution, or everything the organization, company, whatever. The leader, their job is to look down at this. This is an eyeball, by the way. They're looking down at this, right? That's their eye. They got eyelashes, right? Blue eyes. And they're looking down. Their job is to see a holistic view of what's happening, but then also what's the potential for happening. And I feel like everybody kind of knows this part. Their job is to break this into parts and say, in order to achieve our goal, these are the parts of my institution. I mean, I don't even know if we have a theater department, but let's just pretend like we do. So the leader's job is to look down and say, in order to achieve our goals, because this is everything that happens within the institution, right? This is our goal, is to have that positive production, have the highest level of efficiency that we can possibly have. And the leader's job is to see what potential do we have for increasing our productivity, essentially, or in our case, producing better education. Apply that to whatever it is your job does. The leader's job is to break that into parts and figure out how can each element of that organization work together to produce more than what the parts could on their own, right? And so now the manager's job is to make it happen. Make each of these parts happen and make sure that each part is acting as it should. So essentially the manager is a leader, but The manager only looks at their own section, right? Because the leader has to have that ability to visualize, to be that visionary, so to speak, where the managers are ensuring that the doers are doing what they're supposed to be doing and achieving their goals, hitting their deadlines, things like that. So now, kind of going back to how do we get a principle-centered person to fall into this role, right? How do they plug, or where do we plug into this? How do we become that leader that can help these people see? Now, leaders don't necessarily have to be above the entire organization. That's why I'm saying, like, the manager, they are taking care of their parts, but they're still a leader in their own right, because then what it becomes is you have another eyeball. You have another eyeball here because we have the leadership, right? They're doing what we just talked about. But then the manager also acts as a leader because now their job is to do the same thing within their department. And so you have to figure out, as the managers or the top level leaders, how are you going to get that done, right? So now what Covey's kind of recommending is that you, as the leader, be a character driven person or being a principle centered person in your work. And from that, you have to also coax that or cultivate that in your employees. Well, how do you do that? You create a mission statement, is what he says. Okay. So I'm going to pause this video and start a new one just on mission statements and then roll into the quadrants because I want to make this video too long.